Okay, I'm going to make one last short video having to do with Islam, and I just thought this would be a cool picture to start with. This is the inside of a very famous mosque that's actually in southern Spain in Cordoba. Remember, much of what today is Spain was controlled by, Muslim rulers for hundreds of years, and this was a mosque that was there. You can see a specific style of Islamic architecture. So really want to just talk about a little bit about classes in a Muslim society. Really, I'm talking about Muslim society in the first centuries of the Muslim societies. Originally, Arab Muslims were the leaders, and they ruled the areas that they essentially conquered. It was known as the Arab conquest for a reason. Now, the second group in early Muslim society, when I say early, I mean first 100 years, first 200 years or so, were the non-Arab converts. So this would be people who converted to Islam, but were not Arab they were not Arabs ethnically or culturally. So Persians, for instance, essentially the area that is Iran today would fall into that category, and others, but they're just a good example. The last major group in early Islam, this is a word that. So as I was saying, the last group there are the Dhimas. Dhimas meant protected peoples, and Muhammad discusses this in the Quran in different places, and it also is part of Islamic law that we talked about, the Hadith tradition. The Dhimma were the protected peoples. It really was mostly Christians and Jews, the people of the book, because Muhammad did recognize this connection that Islam had with Jews and Christians. We talked about already his perception of Jews and Christians. Also, in Persia, Zoroastrians were also under the protected peoples group, usually. It might have varied from place to place. What does this mean? A Dhimma was not a full, I want to use the right word here. Citizen might not be the right word, but they were not a full member of society the same way the Muslim ruler was. So they had to pay a special tax, for instance, to the Muslim rulers. And there was slavery in Muslim society. There was slavery in most societies for this time still. So I'm not picking on them or saying they were particularly worse necessarily than others. But they definitely practiced slavery. It was part of their religion too. I mean, Muhammad discusses it. And of course, there are probably some similarities with Muhammad's ideas about slavery and the Islamic tradition that are similar to what you see expressed in the Old Testament. Now, they did have rules about slavery in theory, right? And there were also rules about Muslims being slaves too. So, but there were slaves of different types. Over time, Muslims, rulers in the Middle East will actually buy slaves out of Europe and other parts of Asia and Africa. So there will actually be quite a bit of interaction with different groups, different ethnic groups in the Muslim world, as the Muslim world expands in these places too, right? So you had Islam becomes practiced among many in northern and eastern Africa over the next 100 years too, next 100 and 200 years after that. And Islam spreads pretty far east, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, all the way to China and what would be China today, and Southeast Asia and all these places, eventually, India, etc. So Islam spreads quite a bit too. So let's move ahead. Now, women in Islam, I guess it should say women, not woman, but whatever. You see, you get the point. Woman is singular. Now, according to the Quran, a Muslim man was allowed to have 4 wives at one time. So Islam did retain the practice of polygamy. Polygamy is a man, in this case, being able to be married to more than one woman at a time. So bigamy, for instance, would be being married to 2 women. Polygamy would be more than 2, so many women. According to the Quran, Muhammad received a revelation that basically said, this rule is, God says, a man may have 4 wives at one time. Okay? And that is still the case in many, if not all, probably not all, but in most predominantly Muslim countries, polygamy is legally accepted. For instance, Saudi Arabia or Iran. Generally, I don't think it's practiced super widely, but it is seen as a status of wealth. Right, a very wealthy man was going to usually have more than one wife, and like I said, it's going to vary from different Islamic groups, but that is the tradition, and that's what Muhammad taught in the Quran. Now, what's interesting is the Hadith tradition, and you should know what the Hadith was. It was those sayings or writings about Muhammad's life. Identifies up to 14 women who were married to Muhammad at one time or another. There's some debate about this. Different Hadith traditions say different things. So 14 might be the high side. I think somewhere between 11 and 14. I'm not sure. You can look that up. It's not that significant for what I'm talking about here. So, but that is interesting that Muhammad was given this special revelation for him to have more than 4 wives. And that's in the Quran too. And the Hadith tradition says that he had more than 4, obviously. Now, not all those were at the same time. When he was married to his first wife, Khadijah, he was only married to her. It was only after she died, that was his first wife. It was only after she died that he had numerous other wives. But during his time as the prophet and as the leader of the Ummah, he had numerous wives of different ages. Now, important thing to point out is that women are seen in Islam as spiritually equal to men, meaning they have souls. They will be resurrected on the last day. They're made. I don't know if they'd use the term "made in the image of God," but they're made with a spirit or soul like men. They can fall into sin. They can also do good. They can obey God. They can submit to God's will. So women are seen as fully human in that sense. So I want you to understand that. In that sense, it's similar to Christianity. But that didn't mean men and women had all the same roles. And Islam has very spelled out, like many religious groups over time, spelled out roles for men and women. Traditional marriage, I guess if you want to call it that, I don't know if traditional is the right word there, but marriage between men and women was very encouraged. Sex outside of marriage was seen as a sin in Islam. Adultery could be punished very harshly, just like it was in other groups. And generally speaking, and this was the case not just in Islam, but in a lot of cultures, often marriages were arranged by families. That's not necessarily, again, particularly just to Islam, but it was a part of Islamic society and still is in many Islamic societies. For women, the focus is raising children, taking care of children. Again, certainly not the only religion to teach such a thing or society to promote such a thing. And I'm not arguing whether one's good or bad. I'm just saying this is what they taught. Children were seen as the main responsibility of women. And we might think today in a very traditional, quote, old school sense of women being the person who runs the home and takes care of the kids. So that would be something to remember. Divorce was always permitted in Islam, just like it was in the Old Testament, and in some cases for Christians. I think generally speaking, though, at least according to the Gospels, Jesus took a pretty strict view of divorce, or one of the more strict views of divorce, which did influence the Christian position quite a lot. But in most Christian traditions, some form of, we might not call it divorce, but separation of spouses for circumstances was allowed. So I don't want to get into that too much, but I think you understand what I'm saying. In Islam, divorce is permitted. It generally was, and like in many cultures again, was easier for the man to get a divorce than the woman, but that doesn't mean there weren't cases where women could obtain divorces too. Okay? So, but just so you know, there's a whole marriage law associated with Islam. It's part of the Hadith tradition. It's very important. So, the last thing to talk about here is the Islam and the view of the West. We talked about in my last video, Jesus in the Muslim view. That's something you really need to learn about and need to know about is Jesus in the Muslim view, okay? Then the difference between the Jesus of Islam and the Jesus of the Christianity. So I did a whole video about that, so make sure you watch that. We're going to see more about this, how the Muslims and the Europeans interacted with each other later. We're going to be talking about the Crusades, so that'll be in the next section, so I'll wait on that. As he said, there were many Muslim attacks on Europe in the 8th and 9th century. So Southern Europe, Italy, they took over part of Europe, obviously. They continued to attack Constantinople. So we're going to see more about that. As I said, that last point, we're going to wait on that. So that's not going to be on this test. So a lot of this we've already talked about. And that's actually a picture of a war, probably a Crusades battle there. So I'm going to stop right there and hope you have a good day. Thank you.